In this lesson, we'll take a look at how to create a landscape painting using gouache or opaque watercolor. We'll start by lightly sketching out the contours using an HB pencil on a 140-pound cold press watercolor paper. Then we can start mixing colors for the background. We're going to work from the background and progress our way to the foreground. The nature of gouache allows us to do this. Gouache, of course, is opaque watercolor and can be used like traditional translucent watercolor, but it also can be used like opaque painting mediums like acrylics or oils. We'll use the gouache more like an opaque medium in this demonstration. We'll start by mixing primary blue with a bit of titanium white. We'll vary the amount of white that we use in the mixture to create the illusion of some distant clouds. I'm working with Grumbacher Golden Edge nylon brushes to apply the paint. For the most part, I'll be mixing colors using the Winsor & Newton Designer's gouache set, but I'll also be using a bit of Reeves gouache paint as well for some colors that are a little bit more difficult to mix with just the primary set. As you can see here, we can go back and add a few highlights in the clouds with a bit of white. A touch of gray is added in areas before we're ready to move on to the middle ground. We'll start with a light application mixing a yellow green, and then over the top of it, we'll brighten it a bit with another application of a little bit of a lighter yellow green. We can create a bit of variety in the background by adding a bit of burnt sienna and a few indications of darker green. These darker greens are mixed by adding a little bit more blue to the mixture. We'll continue to vary the amount of greens that we create. Now, one thing you'll notice about the gouache is when the colors are applied, the edges are very strong. There's a strong contrast between locations of color. We can go back with a bit of water loaded into the brush and ease these transitions by just brushing over the top. Doing this creates a more painterly effect and eases transitions between values and colors. Now we'll bring another yellow-green over the top of the distant hills. This time we've mixed a bit of yellow ochre in the mix to make it a bit warmer. And we can start developing the overall shape of some of the trees behind the building. We'll start with a dark green here initially. This has been mixed with ivory black and, of course, yellow and blue. Once we have a base color in place, we can start pushing the value relationships. We'll start by mixing a darker version of our green and addressing some of the shadows within the tree. Then we can go over the top and start creating some lighter yellow greens in areas. In this case, the light source is originating from the upper left-hand corner, meaning the shadows will exist primarily in the lower right-hand portion of the trees, and the highlights will exist mainly in the upper left-hand portion of the trees. We'll continue to push the values lighter and darker in areas so that we create a full range of value even in these distant trees. Then we can go back with a bit of water loaded in the brush and ease the transitions of color that we've created. Gouache is an incredibly versatile medium. Unfortunately, though, a lot of artists don't know about it. So if you've never tried gouache before, I encourage it. Not only will it help you improve your watercolor paintings, but it will also help you improve your opaque painting methods as well, including acrylics and oils. Before addressing the final clump of trees behind the building, we'll lighten up the hillside that's closest to the viewer with another application of light yellow-green. Then again, we can revisit this additional collection of trees in the distance, again by following the same procedure. We'll start with a dark green, and then over the top, we'll start addressing some of the shadows and then the highlights. The majority of these trees on the left portion of the picture plane will be covered by a tree that's actually closer to the viewer, but it's still important to address this tree in the same way that we did the others, by developing the highlights and shadows and then going in and smoothing transitions with a bit of water. With a darker green, we'll add a few indications of some shadows that are happening underneath the trees on the right. We'll also bring the shadow in front of the building and underneath the tree. This is simply a darker green. A bit more blue is used in this mixture to indicate a cooler green than the yellow greens that are around it, and a touch of black is used as well. Strokes for this shadowed area are pulled primarily at a diagonal following the contours of the hillside. A few breaks are left open showing some of the yellow-green indicating bits of light getting through. We'll also add a few variations of green here in the foreground to create an illusion of texture, and then we'll go over the top of it with a bit of water to smooth out transitions. Bits of yellow-green are added in areas within the shadow to indicate light filtering through the canopy of trees. Then we can start working on the tree that's closer to the viewer. This tree is primarily in shadow, so we'll start with a very dark green application. We'll be sure to allow specks of the sky to show through. Even though this tree is mostly in shadow, there's still variety in the value. So we'll go back with a slightly lighter green in areas to create a little bit more variety. We can also go back with the smaller brush using a bit of black to indicate a few branches. Now we'll use the same color on the right side of the picture plane for the tree that's closest to the viewer. Here again, we'll want to create some variety in the color, so lighter greens and darker greens are used here. Darker greens are addressed first, and then we can go back with a few lighter greens. The lighter greens, of course, should also be warmer in color temperature, so a bit more yellow is used in the mixture. Then we can start pushing the value relationships in this area. Of course, this tree is closest, so there's going to be stronger contrast between darks and lights. We'll use a darker green initially, and then we can go back with our brush loaded with a bit of water to ease transitions of color and value. And then with the smaller brush, again, we can go back with a very, very dark green to create the illusion of a few branches. Now we can turn our attention to the stone building. We'll start by addressing the opening, and we'll use a very dark gray. We'll go ahead and address the entire side of the building with a cooler gray initially. We'll go over the top of it with a few strokes of warmer gray as well. We'll address the side of the building that will eventually be mostly in shadow. And then we can start creating a variety of different grays for the stones. Now, each one of these grays will add a bit of burnt sienna in areas, we'll add a little bit heavier amounts of ivory black in areas. The main point here is to create quite a bit of variety and to make sure that your brushstrokes are following the form of each individual stone. We'll also add a few indications of some of the mortar that's holding the stones together with a white. And again, we'll continue to develop variety in the stones here with just a variety of different grays, some warmer, some cooler. Then with the brush loaded with water, we can blend these applications together, creating a more natural appearance, a more painterly appearance. Since we're looking at this building from a distance, we won't see all of the details. We'll address the side of the building in the same way, using a variety of different grays until we've built up an acceptable texture. Then using a very light gray, we can start addressing some of the light that's filtering through underneath the tree. We'll apply this mainly to the stones that exist on the left side of the building, but since this is indicating filtered light, a few of the highlights will also exist on the right side of this side of the building. Then, using a brush loaded with water, we can go back and smooth the transitions of color and value. We'll make a few of the values a bit darker to indicate shadow between some of the stones. And then, of course, we can strengthen the highlights in areas as well. Now we'll address the roof of the building. We'll start with a mixture of burnt sienna and a bit of primary red. We'll carefully cover the entire shape with this color, pulling strokes in the direction of the contours of the roof. Then we can start addressing some of the variety and value that happens on the top of the roof. Some of the roof is lighter, so we'll use a lighter version of this color to address these sections. We can strengthen the highlight that happens along the peak of the roof with a slightly lighter version of our color. Then, using a bit of water, we can ease the transitions. We'll darken the shadow that happens underneath the overhang of the roof on the left side with a darker version of the color. We'll also strengthen the shadows that happen on the left side of the roof as well. We'll put a shadow underneath the peak and pull a bit of darker value down along the side of the roof. We can also strengthen the shadow underneath the overhang a bit further and increase the shadow that happens on the side of the building underneath the overhang with a darker gray. Now we're ready to begin addressing the stone wall that happens in front of the building. We'll start with a light application of a mixture using yellow ochre, white, and just a touch of burnt sienna. We'll cover all the rocks completely. Then we can go back and establish the edges of each one of the stones using a dark gray. We'll go back with our brush loaded with water and soften up these lines a bit, pulling some of the darker values into the rocks. These rocks are covered with a beautiful moss, so we'll start with a darker green and start applying a light translucent application over the rocks. These applications are darker and stronger in the areas of shadow on the front side of the rock wall. Then we can go back over the top of these applications with an even lighter and brighter yellow-green. Here again, we'll develop quite a bit of variety in color and value. We can then darken up the shadows in between each individual rock. And of course, just as we have in other areas throughout the painting, we'll want to increase the contrast, creating the illusion of light. So we'll go back and we'll increase some of the highlights that happen on the rocks and areas, indicating light filtering through the canopy of trees. These highlights, of course, are addressed with a much lighter version of the original color that we used for the rocks. It's mixed with titanium white, a bit of yellow ochre, and a touch of burnt sienna, but it's dominated by the titanium white. Then, of course, we can go back with the brush, loaded with a bit of water, to smooth transitions of color and value. We'll strengthen up the shadow underneath the rock wall, just in front of it, and just along the side of it as well, with a darker yellow-green. We'll also add a few indications of some brighter and lighter yellow-green where light is filtering through the canopy of trees along the grass. Then it's back to the stone wall to create a bit more variety in the greens of the moss. We can also strengthen the shadow on the rock wall underneath the tree with a darker gray. Now all that's left to address is the tree that's closest to the viewer. We'll start with a base application using a mixture of yellow ochre, white, burnt sienna, and a touch of primary blue to make it appear a bit more green. We'll cover the entire shape of the tree initially. Then we can start to address some of the values that happen on the tree and around it. We'll start with a stronger indication of the shadow behind the tree with a dark green. Then by adding a bit of black to our base color, we can start addressing the shadows that happen up in the upper portion of the tree. Initially, we'll apply these colors strongly with the gouache, and then we'll go over the top of it with a bit of water to ease transitions. You can see here that going over the top of this application with water really smooths the transitions between dark and light and makes for a more believable and realistic appearance. Then we'll start pushing the contrast between the darks and the lights. We'll add a bit of white to our mixture and start addressing some of the highlights or lighter values that happen on the side of the tree. And here again, we'll go back over the top of these applications with a bit of water to smooth transitions. On the upper part of the trunk of the tree, some light is filtering in through the canopy of leaves. We'll address this with a mixture of white with just a touch of primary yellow. As the gouache dries, the intensity of our initial applications weakens, so we may have to go over these areas a few times to create the intensity that we need. These shapes that we're making of highlights up in the upper portion of the trunk should mimic the shapes that would be created by leaves. We can also strengthen the light on the side of the tree as well, and then darken some of the shadows in the upper portion to increase the contrast. Since this shadowed section on the upper portion of the tree is created by the canopy of leaves, the lower edge of the shadow should mimic the shapes of leaves as well. We'll add a bit of moss on the side of the tree just as we did on the rocks, starting with a darker green and then progressively getting lighter and more yellow with the greens that we add. We'll continue to strengthen the contrast between light and dark and further the illusion of light by adding a few more lighter values. Then a few of the leaves wrap around the front side of the tree. So here we'll start with a dark green application of the leaves on the front side of the tree. We'll strengthen this by making a few of the values quite a bit darker, and then add a bit of variety by making some of the values lighter. And now our gouache landscape painting is complete. If you enjoyed this video, I encourage you to subscribe to the channel. And if you're ready to learn even more about drawing and painting, then why not check out our comprehensive membership program, which includes video courses, weekly live lessons, ebooks, lesson plans, and much, much more. To learn more about our program, just click on the button in the center of the screen or click on the card in the upper right-hand corner. Thank you so much for watching.